Hello and welcome to the Week 2 Supplemental lecture on Anne McClintock's The Lay of the Land, Genealogies of Imperialism. For this piece, note that you've got a very big section in the PDF that the library has made available, but it's actually only a small number of those pages that you're being asked to read and therefore that I'll talk about today. So this is a work that explores an aspect of the more sort of direct relationship between science and imperialism. The general lectures this term were talking about the ways in which you can get some reactions to the universalist claims of science because of the involvement in the same European nations that are promoting the universalism of science in the imperial project. This is a work, and it's one of many, many works that do this, that look at some of the metaphors that cross back and forth between the industrial core and the colonial environment, and in this particular case particularly interested in metaphors around sexuality and race, and the way in which these are used to police and to rationalize forms of imperial and state power through the 19th century. So the section that we're assigning, McClintock begins with Engels, whom we'll meet again next week, looking at some of his work with Marx. But Engels investigating the conditions of the factory workers, and McClintock says he starts off with a very interesting discussion in his preface about claiming to find more than mere Englishmen, members of a single isolated nation. He finds instead men, members of the great and universal family of mankind. Okay, so this sounds like a possibly positive universalizing statement, transcending individual differences to make something better or greater out of them. But then she goes into more detail about the text as it goes through and says actually the text is shot through with metaphors around domesticity and degeneracy, so metaphors around the proper role of women and the status or health of races that undercut his ostensible commitment to a universal family of mankind. She talks particularly about passages in which he talks about how women's work in the factory destroys the family, and she suggests that this reflects a broader crisis at the time that he's writing around domesticity and what domesticity means and where it fits in, as some of the functions that used to be performed by the family are increasingly taken over by institutions outside the family. And then she also finds references shot through Engels' work of degenerate races robbed of humanity, degraded, reduced morally and intellectually to bestiality. This idea that you can fall into a degenerate racial condition due to external circumstances, but also this imagery of empire, this hierarchy of races that is imported into the industrial core and that Engels regards as impactful in part because it would be shocking that it's being applied in the context he's applying it. So McClintock says, one witnesses here the figure of a double displacement. Global history is imaged as a universal family. Okay, so by imaging global history as a family, and she has in mind the family tree, the genealogical relationship between humans, or the evolutionary relationship, she says this is interesting because it's a domestic metaphor. So we're visualizing all of humanity is related as a family and domestic space, while domestic crises are imagined in racial terms. So the crises in the industrial core inside the domestic economy are imaged racially. They pull metaphors from the experience of empire. After the 1850s, I suggest presiding contradictions within industrial modernity between private and public, domesticity and industry, labor and leisure, paid work and unpaid work, metropolis and empire, were systematically mediated by these two dominant discourses, the trope of degeneration, reversible as the progress trope, and the trope of the family of man. And so she's going to talk about both of these at greater length. The notion that progress is haunted by the fear of sliding back into degeneracy, and then that there is this family of man which she's going to unpack in terms of the natural power relations that are understood to apply within that family. So she talks about images of race, gender, and the family as they run through popular culture, political culture, and the beginnings of the social sciences in the 19th century. She says that there's a blending together of discourses around race and sexuality, both of which are used to control problematic populations, and both of which start to blend together. So degenerate classes in the core, the working classes, the poor, radical, political participants, are policed via a racial deviance discourse, by a notion of degeneracy, by a notion of danger that's predicated on that degeneracy. And then sexual deviance discourses are used not only in the core but also in the colonies, and so there are images of indigenous populations as being promiscuous or as being effeminate, or these various sorts of discourses that carry across. So there's a co-implication of racial and gender images that are being used to control subordinate populations, both inside the industrial core and in the periphery, in the colonies. She notes that the concept of an evolutionary family expresses contradictory visions of world history. There are quite critical, quite radical uses of the concept of an evolutionary family. It's an important concept in some dimensions, for example, of the abolitionist or anti-slavery movement. But it also has use in rationalizing particular power relations. So for some people this image is a radically egalitarian image that talks about the lack of natural differences between people, but for some it turns into a developmental discourse where people are placed on a continuum. And there's a distinction in that sense between the Darwinism that comes out of Darwin and social Darwinism, which is a popularized and quite different hierarchized use of this kind of imagery. And then she says at the same time that you're getting the family of man, this sort of evolutionary family emphasized, the actual family, households, domestic environments, as institutions start being treated as ahistorical. And this hits on something that we'll talk a bit next week. There is an image of what is natural and artificial that runs through a lot of classical liberal thinking, where the artificial is what has to be created through conscious political decision-making, often in political institutions in a formal sense. Things that arise outside those conscious institutions are often perceived as spontaneously self-organizing, and what is spontaneously self-organizing is natural. And so you've got nature itself, which comes to be understood as a material world of objects that interact with one another and have their own autonomous laws that have nothing to do with humans. The market is another sphere of human activity that's understood to be spontaneously self-organizing if we don't interfere with it. But things like the family also fall into that sphere of spontaneous self-organization because they're not things that are perceived to be instituted by conscious political acts. So she notes, figured as existing naturally beyond the commodity market, beyond politics, and beyond history proper. This is the family as an organic, spontaneously emergent institution. But the family is taken to embody and express natural power relations. So there are hierarchies within the family. It's not perceived as an egalitarian space. Men are in a higher position in the hierarchy relative to women. Adults are in a hierarchy over children. And she says that the extension of the family metaphor, when we start talking about other kinds of things as families, like a family of humankind, the notion that there are natural hierarchies within that bigger family begins to blend and slide across as well. So she says, after the 1850s, the image of the natural patriarchal family in alliance with pseudoscientific social Darwinism, and again, this isn't Darwinism from Darwin, it is a popularizing kind of distorted appropriation, came to constitute the organizing trope for marshalling a bewildering array of cultures into a single global narrative ordered and managed by Europeans. Okay, so the metaphor of the family of humankind becomes, by analogy with the patriarchal family, the hierarchical family, a way to rationalize the fact that you've also got a hierarchy of nations, with some nations ruling over the populations of others. And then this discourse of degeneration. So The notion of progress, the desire to move forward, is haunted by the fear of regression, of moving backward along that continuum of degenerating. And degeneration becomes a very powerful, very potent explanatory framework for social crisis. So why do you have crime? Why do you have rebellion? Why do you have revolt? Why do you have various other sort of social ills? Degeneracy is understood to be the reason, rather than social institutions or something that we could actually change. Degeneracy is something bred in, and so if you think that's the cause, your social policy is going to be around rounding people up, preventing people from breeding, these sorts of things. So the concept is associated with a policing of sexuality. There is a fear of contagion, a fear of the spread of degeneracy, particularly by uncontrolled sexuality. So, she says, body boundaries were felt to be dangerously permeable and demanding continual purification, so that sexuality, in particular women's sexuality, was cordoned off as the central transmitter of racial and hence cultural contagion. And she talks about a range of different sources that imply that the control of sexuality and fertility was perceived as essential for preserving the purity of the race, and the purity of the race is necessary for the strength of the nation, for the strength of the empire. Concerns about degeneracy are used to legitimize state interventions and become one of the ways that the state begins to grow into its modern functions, its functions of managing populations, of managing health and safety. These degeneracy fears are one of the initial drivers for that move. And then there's a development and proliferation of purportedly scientific systems for measuring degeneracy, measuring the size of people's skulls, measuring IQ, things like this. And so things that appear to be scientific, that at the time are part of the mainstream of science, are involved in, implicated in these campaigns against degeneracy, the treatment of degeneracy. And obviously after World War II, these things then come into disrepute, which has some impact on some of the critical analysis of science that we'll read a bit later in the term.